I spent my entire childhood being told I ruined my mother's life just by being born, while my older brother got everything handed to him and never once had to explain why. I spent my 20s trying to buy back the love that was supposedly mine to earn, paying off his debts, paying her bills, until the day she demanded I hand over the house I built with my own 2 hands. That's when I finally went looking for the truth about what really happened the year I was born. And it turned out the person who destroyed this family was sitting across the table from me the entire time, telling everyone else it was my fault. I'm Marissa Kendrick, 31 years old, a senior financial analyst at a mid-sized logistics firm in Columbus, Ohio. And for the first 26 years of my life, I believed, with the kind of stubborn hope that only a child raised on scraps of affection can sustain, that if I just worked hard enough, achieved enough, gave enough, my mother would eventually look at me the way she looked at my older brother Dalton. And so this is the story of how that hope finally died, and how I found out that the death of that hope was the single best thing that ever happened to me. And I want to warn you now that this is long, because the wound took 26 years to open, and it took another 5 to close. And none of it makes sense without the whole picture. So bear with me, because by the end you'll understand exactly why I did what I did at my grandmother's 80th birthday party in front of 11 relatives, and why I have 0 regrets about it. None, not one single regret, even though half my extended family still thinks I'm the villain of this story. And I've made my peace with that too, because I know the truth, and the truth is the only thing that ever mattered to me, growing up in that house where truth was whatever my mother decided it should be on any given day, depending on her mood and how much wine she'd had and how much money she needed that week. And so here it is, the whole thing, start to finish, the way it actually happened, not the way she still tells it at family gatherings I'm no longer invited to but hear about anyway, because my aunt still checks in on me even though the rest of them pretend I don't exist. Growing up in our house in a working-class suburb outside Dayton, there were 2 currencies that mattered, love and money, and Dalton, who was 4 years older than me, had an inexhaustible supply of both while I had access to neither. Not because our family was actually poor, though my mother loved to claim poverty whenever it suited her narrative, but because whatever resources existed flowed in one direction only, toward the son who could do no wrong. And I want to be clear that I don't say this with any residual bitterness toward Dalton himself, because Dalton didn't ask to be worshipped any more than I asked to be the family's designated disappointment. We were both just cast in roles our mother wrote for us before either of us understood what a role even was. Dalton got the new bicycle for his 8th birthday, while I got a hand-me-down from a neighbor 2 years later. Dalton got piano lessons because our mother decided he had a gift, while when I asked at 9 years old if I could try the same lessons, she told me flatly that music lessons were wasted on a kid who won't stick with anything. A prophecy she made sure came true by simply never allowing me to try. Dalton never once washed a dish in that house growing up. Not one, while I was scrubbing pots standing on a step stool by the time I was 7 because my arms weren't long enough to reach the bottom of the sink. And when I complained, even mildly, even just once, that it didn't seem fair, my mother's favorite response was some version of, "Life isn't fair. Get used to it," delivered with a flatness that told me even then she wasn't troubled by the unfairness. She had simply decided I was the one who should get used to it and Dalton was the one who should be spared it. And for years I assumed, the way children do, that there must be some reason for this, some logic I hadn't figured out yet, some flaw in me that justified the difference. And so I spent my entire childhood trying to locate and fix that flaw, which is, I now understand, exactly the trap my mother wanted me in. Because a child hunting for her own defects is a child who will work herself half to death trying to earn love that was never conditional on performance in the first place. It was conditional on being the right child, the one she had decided, for reasons I wouldn't understand until I was 28 years old, to resent. The breaking point of my childhood, the single memory I can still feel in my chest like a physical bruise even now, happened on my 12th birthday. I remember the date exactly, March the 14th, because I remember thinking, even at 12, that I would never forget it, and I haven't. There was no cake that year, which wasn't unusual. Birthdays in our house were always smaller and quieter than Dalton's, but I still had some childish hope that maybe this year would be different. Maybe 12 was a milestone that mattered, and instead what happened was that my mother came into the kitchen where I was sitting at the table doing homework, and out of absolutely nowhere, unprompted, unprovoked, she looked at me with an expression I can only describe as pure resentment and said, "You know, everything in this family started falling apart the year you were born." And then she just walked away, into the living room, turned on the television, and never mentioned it again, as if she hadn't just detonated a bomb in her 12-year-old daughter's chest on the one day that was supposed to be about celebrating that daughter's existence. And I sat there at that kitchen table for probably 20 minutes without moving, doing the math in my head, trying to figure out what had happened the year I was born that could possibly be my fault. I was a baby. I didn't do anything except exist, and yet somehow that existing was the crime. And I carried that sentence with me for the next 14 years of my life like a stone sewn into the lining of my coat. It never got lighter. I just got better at pretending I couldn't feel the weight of it. Later, much later, I would learn that the year I was born was also the year my father's small auto parts business failed, and he had to take a lower-paying job at a factory, and the year my parents' marriage started its long, slow collapse toward the divorce that would happen when I was 15. And I understand now, with the clarity that only distance and therapy can provide, that my mother needed somewhere to put all of that disappointment and fear and grief, and rather than examine her own choices, or my father's, or simply accept that businesses fail and marriages fail for complicated adult reasons that have nothing to do with a newborn baby, she found it infinitely easier to hand the blame to the smallest, least powerful person in the house, the person who could never argue back, the person who would spend the next 2.5 decades trying to make up for a debt that was never actually hers. So that's what I did. I became, without ever consciously deciding to, the family's designated fixer, the good girl, the responsible one, the one who got straight A's not because I loved learning, though I did come to love it eventually, but because grades were the only currency I had access to that might, possibly, someday, buy me some fraction of the warmth Dalton got for free. I got a partial academic scholarship to Ohio State and worked 2 part-time jobs on top of a full course load to cover the rest, waiting tables at a diner on weekends and tutoring high schoolers in math on weeknights, while Dalton, 3 years into a gap that eventually became 6 years, drifted between community college semesters he rarely finished and jobs he rarely kept longer than 4 months. Jobs my mother always described to relatives as him figuring things out, or between opportunities, language she never once extended to describe my own struggles, which were simply expected, simply the baseline, simply what a daughter like me was supposed to endure without complaint or credit. By 24, I had my degree, a stable job in finance, my own apartment, and for the first time in my life, actual disposable income. And I want to be honest about what I did with that income, because it wasn't wise, not by half, but it made a certain broken kind of sense to the person I was at the time. I started sending money home, not because anyone was starving, but because I had this theory, this quiet, desperate theory I never said aloud to anyone, that if I could just be generous enough, useful enough, indispensable enough, my mother would finally see me the way she saw Dalton. So I paid for her car repairs. I bought her a nice winter coat 2 Christmases in a row. I picked up the tab whenever we went out to eat as a family. And when Dalton, at 28 and between opportunities for what felt like the dozenth time, ran up almost $9,000 in credit card debt from a failed attempt at starting an online reselling business that was really just an excuse to buy expensive sneakers and resell maybe 1 in every 20 pairs, I paid that off too, quietly, at my mother's request, framed as, just this once to help your brother get back on his feet. And I believed her. God, I actually believed her, because believing her was easier than accepting that just this once was a phrase that would repeat itself, with only slight variations, for the next 3 years. The problem with feeding a bottomless need for validation with actual money is that the people receiving the money have absolutely no incentive to ever stop asking. And I watched, slowly, as my mother and Dalton's expectations calcified into something that no longer resembled gratitude at all. It became assumption. It became entitlement. My mother started referring to my salary in front of other relatives as though it were a shared family resource, telling my aunt at one Easter gathering that Marissa's doing so well. She's really been a blessing for this family, which sounds like a compliment until you understand the subtext, which was that my worth to her had finally, after 26 years, been located, and it was purely financial. I had become useful, and useful in my mother's economy was the closest thing to loved that she was capable of offering. And for a while, God help me, I took it. I took the scraps of blessing and so proud of you and treated them like the love I'd been starving for my whole life. Because starving people don't ask if the food is good, they just eat. The real turning point, the event that started unraveling everything, came when I was 28, 3 years ago now, when after years of careful saving, side consulting work, and yes, cutting back significantly on how much I was sending home, I finally bought a house, a modest 3-bedroom colonial in a quiet neighborhood outside Columbus. Nothing extravagant, but it was mine, paid for with my own money, my own credit, my own decade of hustling, and it represented to me the first tangible proof that all of that striving had actually built something real and permanent, something no one could take away. And I was, for maybe 6 weeks, purely and simply happy. The kind of happy I hadn't let myself feel in years, because happiness always felt like it was inviting some kind of punishment. The punishment came at Thanksgiving. Dalton, now 32, had gotten himself into serious trouble. Not the sneaker reselling kind of trouble. Real trouble. He'd co-signed on a car loan for a girlfriend who then left him with the payments and the vehicle. He'd racked up over $22,000 across 3 credit cards, funding a lifestyle he could not remotely afford. And rather than face any of this himself, he had apparently, according to my mother, been under so much stress that he needed the family to step in. And by the family, of course, she meant me. And by step in, she meant something far beyond what I had ever done before. At dinner that Thursday, in front of my aunt and uncle and my grandmother, my mother set down her fork, looked directly at me, and said that given that I now had all this equity sitting in a house, and given that Dalton was family, and family helps family, it was time for me to either take out a home equity loan to cover his debts or, and I remember the exact words because I have replayed them in my head roughly 4,000 times since, seriously consider putting the house in both your names so he has something to fall back on, since you clearly don't need all that space just for yourself. I sat there for a moment in complete silence, waiting for someone, anyone, my aunt, my uncle, my own grandmother, to say something, to push back, to acknowledge how insane this request was. And when no one did, when my aunt just looked down at her plate and my uncle suddenly became very interested in the cranberry sauce, I understood that this had probably already been discussed before I arrived, that this ambush had been planned, and something in me, some long-dormant instinct for self-preservation, finally woke up, and I said, as calmly as I could manage, that I would not be doing that Dalton's debts were his responsibility, and that I needed some time to process what had just been asked of me, and my mother's face did something I will never forget. It went from warm and expectant to genuinely cold in under 2 seconds, and she said quietly enough that only I could really hear it, but with a viciousness that cut through the noise of the table like a blade. You owe this family. You've owed us since the day you showed up and ruined everything. The least you can do is help fix what you started. And there it was again. That same sentence from my 12th birthday, 14 years later. Still loaded, still aimed directly at my chest. Except this time I was 28 years old with a finance degree and a mortgage, and a therapist I'd started seeing 8 months earlier for what I'd been calling, generically, family stress. And something about hearing that accusation again as an adult, rather than as a frightened child, made me actually stop and think for the first time in my life, wait, what actually happened the year I was born? What did I actually do? And I realized, sitting at that Thanksgiving table with cranberry sauce going cold in front of me, that I had never once asked. I'd spent 26 years absorbing the guilt without ever once demanding the receipts, so I decided to get them. Over the following 2 months, I did something I probably should have done a decade earlier. I reached out to my grandmother's older sister, my great-aunt Louise, who was 83 at the time and had, by reputation, no filter and no patience for family nonsense, which made her exactly the right person to talk to. And I also tracked down my father, who I hadn't spoken to in any real depth since the divorce when I was 15, but who agreed somewhat awkwardly to meet me for coffee and answer some questions. And between the two of them, plus some old bank statements my father still had in a storage unit from the divorce proceedings, a much clearer, much uglier picture began to emerge, and it went like this. My father's auto parts business hadn't failed because of some cosmic bad luck that arrived with my birth. It had failed because my mother, who handled the books, had taken out 2 undisclosed personal loans against the business's line of credit to cover a series of bad investments in a multi-level marketing skincare company she'd gotten involved with the year before I was born, investments she never told my father about until the business's creditors came calling. And the marriage hadn't collapsed because of financial stress caused by a baby. It had collapsed, according to my father, because he'd discovered the hidden loans roughly 18 months after my birth, and the trust between them never recovered. And my great-aunt Louise, who apparently had no problem being blunt about any of this, told me over the phone, in words I will remember exactly for the rest of my life, "Honey, your mother has never in her life taken responsibility for a single decision she's made. She blew that business up with her own 2 hands and then found herself a baby small enough to blame for it. That's not a mystery. That's just your mother. She's always needed someone to be the reason things went wrong, and it certainly wasn't going to be her." I sat with that for a long time. 26 years of guilt. The entire architecture of how I understood myself and my place in that family had been built on a lie so convenient and so cruel that I honestly didn't know whether to feel devastated or furious. And eventually I landed on furious because devastation would have kept me small and furious was going to get me my life back. I spent the next several months in therapy specifically unpacking this, learning terms I hadn't had before: scapegoating, family systems, the golden child and the scapegoat as two sides of the same dysfunctional coin, both of us cast into roles neither of us chose, both of us damaged by the same source, just in opposite directions. And I want to say that learning this didn't make me hate Dalton. If anything, it made me pity him more, because at least I got to build a self independent of my mother's approval. Dalton never got the chance to develop that muscle. He'd been so thoroughly enabled and protected from consequence that he had no idea how to function without someone catching him every time he fell. And someone was always going to have to catch him. And my mother had decided a long time ago that the someone was going to be me. But knowing this, understanding the mechanics of it, didn't mean I was willing to keep playing the role. My grandmother's 80th birthday party came at the perfect, or perhaps the worst possible time. 5 months after that Thanksgiving dinner, my mother had continued, throughout those months, to bring up the house situation at every opportunity. Texting me articles about family loyalty, leaving voicemails that alternated between guilt trips and outright accusations of selfishness. At one point telling me that if something happened to Dalton because I refused to help, that would be on my conscience for the rest of my life. A manipulation so blatant that even 6 months earlier I might have been shaken by it. But by then, armed with the truth about what had actually happened the year I was born, it just made me tired. And a little sad for her, honestly, that this was still her only tool. The party was held at a banquet hall my aunt had rented, and it was a big affair. Over 40 people, cousins and second cousins and family friends I hadn't seen in years, and I almost didn't go. My therapist and I had actually discussed whether I should skip it entirely, but my grandmother, whatever her flaws in staying silent over the years, had never actively participated in the scapegoating the way my mother had, and I loved her. And I wanted to be there for her, so I went, and I told myself I would simply avoid my mother and Dalton as much as possible and leave early if things got tense. That plan lasted about 90 minutes. I was standing near the dessert table talking to my cousin Priya about her new job when my mother approached, wine glass in hand, Dalton trailing a few steps behind her with the particular sheepish posture he always had when he knew a conversation was about to happen that he didn't have the spine to start himself, and my mother, in front of Priya, in front of my aunt who had drifted over, in front of at least 6 other relatives within easy earshot, said brightly, performatively, the way people do when they've rehearsed something and want an audience for it. So Marissa, I was just telling everyone how generous you've always been to this family, and I think it's time we talk again about helping your brother. Don't you think 5 months is long enough to think it over? And I felt something in me go very still, very calm, the way I imagine people describe the moment right before a decision that's been building for years finally arrives, and I said, loud enough for the small cluster of relatives around us to hear clearly, actually, since you brought this up in front of everyone, I think it's time we talk about something else too. My mother's face flickered, just slightly, a crack in the performance, but she recovered fast, telling me this wasn't the time or place. And I said, and I remember this part word for word because I had, if I'm honest, rehearsed it a little myself in the shower a few times over those 5 months. You've been telling this family for 26 years that everything went wrong the year I was born. You told me that on my 12th birthday, and you've been reminding me of it ever since, one way or another. So I did some digging. Dad still has the old bank statements. Aunt Louise remembers everything. The business didn't fail because of me. It failed because you took out 2 secret loans behind Dad's back to fund a skincare pyramid scheme, and when he found out, that's what actually ended the marriage. I was a baby. I didn't ruin anything. You did, and then you spent the next 2.5 decades making sure I paid for it instead of you. The banquet hall got very quiet. The kind of quiet where you can hear the ice machine humming in the kitchen, and my mother's face went through about 4 different expressions in the span of maybe 3 seconds. Shock, then anger, then something that almost looked like fear, and she started to say something about how I was twisting things and being dramatic in front of her mother's birthday party. But my great-aunt Louise, 83 years old and completely unbothered by social convention, said loudly enough for the whole room, "She's not twisting anything, Diane," I told her myself. And frankly, I'm glad someone finally said it out loud. I've been biting my tongue about this for 20 years. And that more than anything I said myself was the moment the room actually shifted. Because it wasn't just me anymore. It was an 83-year-old woman who had no reason to lie, corroborating every word. And my mother, who thrives on controlling narratives, had just lost control of this one in front of the entire extended family. She tried a few more angles, accusing me of being ungrateful for everything I did for you growing up, which nearly made me laugh out loud given the context, and then pivoting to Dalton, gesturing at him and saying that regardless of ancient history, he needed help now. And this was when I said the thing that I think actually ended the conversation for good. I looked at Dalton directly, not unkindly, and said, "Dalton, I actually don't think you're a bad person. I think you were raised by someone who never let you develop the ability to handle a single consequence in your life, and that's not fair to you either. But it's not my job to keep fixing that, and it never should have been." Dalton, to his credit, didn't say much. He just looked at the floor, and I genuinely believe some small part of him knew I was right. Though he wasn't going to say so in front of our mother, not that day anyway. My mother spent the rest of that conversation, and honestly the rest of that party, alternating between cold silence and quiet mutters to my aunt about how I'd embarrassed her and chosen the worst possible day to bring this up, conveniently ignoring that she was the one who chose to make her demand in public in the first place. And I left about 40 minutes later, hugged my grandmother, told her I loved her and was sorry for any disruption, and drove home with what I can only describe as an almost physical sensation of a weight lifting off my chest that I had been carrying for so long I'd forgotten it was even possible to exist without it. In the weeks that followed, my mother tried everything. Guilt-laden voicemails accusing me of destroying the family, a long rambling text message insisting I had always been jealous of Dalton and had waited my whole life for a chance to attack her, a bizarre Facebook post, vague enough to not name me directly, but obvious enough to anyone who knew our situation, about ungrateful children, and how some people forget everything a mother sacrifices. And I want to be honest that for about a week, this got to me. Old habits and old guilt don't dissolve overnight just because you've uncovered the truth. But my therapist reminded me of something that stuck, that my mother's reaction to losing control wasn't evidence that I was wrong. It was evidence of exactly how much control she'd been used to having, and people don't rage that hard over losing something small. So I made the decision that had honestly been building in me since that Thanksgiving dinner, and I went no contact, blocked her number, blocked her on every social platform, sent one final message, calm and short, saying that I loved my grandmother and would stay in touch with her and with my aunt, but that I would no longer be available for calls, visits, or financial requests from my mother or Dalton, and that this wasn't punishment. It was simply the end of a dynamic that had cost me nearly 3 decades of my life, and then I didn't respond to anything that came after that, not the angry follow-ups, not the attempts through my aunt to pass along a message, nothing. It's been almost 2 years now since that birthday party. And I won't pretend it's been simple or entirely painless. There were nights early on where the guilt crept back in, where some small, stubborn, 12-year-old part of me wondered if I'd been too harsh, too cold, if a good daughter would have found a way to forgive and rebuild. But therapy helped me understand that forgiveness without accountability isn't healing. It's just more of the same pattern dressed up in nicer language. And I've since learned, through my aunt, who still updates me occasionally, even though I've asked her not to dwell on it too much, that Dalton, deprived of both my money and, it turns out, my mother's ability to keep bailing him out since she herself was never in as strong a financial position as she pretended, has fallen significantly behind on his debts, that there's been serious tension between him and our mother, now that there's no third party absorbing the fallout of either of their decisions, and that my mother has told at least a few relatives a version of events where I abandoned the family out of nowhere. A story that, from what my aunt tells me, isn't landing quite the way it used to, now that Great Aunt Louise is willing to correct the record whenever it comes up. As for me, I've spent the last 2 years doing things I never really let myself do before, actually enjoying my house without feeling like it was on loan from someone else's approval, dating someone kind and stable for the first time in my life, a man named Theo who has never once made me feel like my worth was conditional on what I could provide him, continuing therapy not because I'm in crisis anymore, but because I like who I'm becoming, and rebuilding a relationship with my father that, while still a little awkward given the lost years, has become one of the more genuinely warm relationships in my life. And I still see my grandmother, quietly, without my mother's involvement, and those visits are some of the only unconditionally comfortable family time I've ever had. There's one more thing I haven't told anyone outside my therapist's office, which is that about 8 months ago, Dalton reached out to me, not through our mother, not through my aunt, but directly, a text message out of nowhere on a Tuesday night that just said, "Hey, I know I don't deserve to say this. I'm sorry. I should have stood up for you a long time ago and I didn't, because it was easier not to." And I sat with my phone in my hand for a long time before I answered, because part of me wanted to be angry at him too, wanted to fold him into the same category as our mother and be done with the whole family in one clean motion. But the truth is Dalton was 12 when I was born, and by the time he was old enough to understand what was happening to me, he'd already spent a decade being taught that love was something you received without ever having to notice who wasn't receiving it, and I don't think that excuses the years of silence, but it does explain them. And so I wrote back something short, that I appreciated him saying it, that I wasn't ready for a relationship the way things used to be, but that I wasn't opposed to slowly figuring out what an honest one might look like. One without our mother in the middle of it. One where he wasn't asking me for anything, and I wasn't performing usefulness for him either. And we've texted a handful of times since. Careful, tentative, the way you'd handle something fragile you weren't sure could hold weight again. And he told me in one of those conversations that he'd started seeing a financial counselor through a nonprofit that helps people restructure debt, that it was slow and humiliating in ways he hadn't expected, having to sit across from a stranger and explain exactly how he'd ended up owing what he owed, but that for the first time he was doing it without expecting someone else to swoop in and make the number disappear. And I felt something complicated reading that, not quite forgiveness, not quite pride, but something adjacent to both. A recognition that maybe the collapse of our mother's system had done for him, in its own brutal way, what indulgence never could, forced him to finally meet the floor instead of being caught before he ever touched it. I don't know if Dalton and I will ever be close in the way siblings are supposed to be close. We lost too many years to two entirely different kinds of damage, but I've stopped needing to know the ending of that particular story in order to feel at peace with how the larger one turned out. I think about that 12-year-old girl sitting at the kitchen table on her birthday sometimes, and what I'd tell her if I could, and it wouldn't be complicated, it would just be this. None of it was ever her fault. Not the business, not the divorce, not any of it. She was just a baby who happened to be born in a hard year, and the person who was supposed to protect her from that hardship chose instead to hand it to her, piece by piece for 26 years. And she doesn't owe anyone the rest of her life to keep paying off a debt that was never actually hers to begin with. And if there's anything I want anyone reading this to take away from it, it's that the debt was never yours, whoever you are. Whatever version of this you might be living through right now, and walking away from people who need you, broke more than they need you whole, is not cruelty. It is. As strange as it might sound, coming from the person who spent nearly 3 decades believing the opposite, the closest thing to freedom I have ever known.